Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Chinese Australian Historical Society, in association with the State Library of New South Wales, 2020 Henry Chan Lecture. Multicultural Citizenship Reimagined, Engaging Migrants from China. I'm Daphne Lowe Kelly, the President of the Chinese Australian Historical Society, and I'd like to firstly acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I would like to acknowledge the presence of the Honourable Helen Sham Ho, who is an honorary patron of...
for some time now in a not very nice public debate. They raise some interesting questions about the evolution of our policy on immigration and settlement. At the end of the Second World War, when Australia first introduced large-scale immigration, not from the UK but from European countries, it recognised a basic fact that you can't just shovel large numbers of people into your society and have it work. You have to work at it. You have to ease the transition for the people coming in and for the people who are already here. You have to set up programs to make it work for both, and you have to have an effective program of, in the best sense of the word, of propaganda, of information, of constant positive messaging, so that the populace as a whole is brought along with you. Now, as we know, at the beginning, the policy was a policy of assimilation, and this was not a very benign or culturally aware policy, but nevertheless, the government applied those principles to try to make this new large-scale immigration program work. And when assimilation was overtaken by a new policy of integration, the same thing happened. This was in the very early 1960s, and new programs were put in place to support it. More English language learning and other educational opportunities for migrants, and more talking up the benefits of immigration to the populace as a whole. And then, of course, in 1973 we had the formal arrival of multiculturalism. And again, these imperatives continued and the same principles applied. So for a long period in our immigration history, governments saw the need to really work at settlement, the welcoming of migrants, and ensuring that migrants could have a good transition into their new society. This went on until the mid to late 90s, and in my view, from about that time on, we started to lose the plot. And if you look at the zigzags of policy on settlement since that time, it's very clear that governments of both persuasions, governments didn't really have a philosophy of immigration and settlement. They didn't have a coherent policy. They didn't have a good, strong, positive message. And they mucked around with the agencies responsible for immigration and settlement, now in one department, now in another, mixing them up and putting them in other departments. And so it went on, at least for the last 2 decades, with only one consistent message, and that was that migrants are good, migration is good for the economy. So, fine, good for the economy. Pay great attention to that, but neglect the other important things of actually making it work. And we can see it in very recent times starting to fall apart because of this neglect. If you look, for example, for a clear and positive message from government, sustained over time, it's very difficult to find it. Now and then, yeah, they make a statement, something happens, some minister says, yeah, well, you know, this is, yeah, we are such and such citizens are good people and we welcome immigration and so on, but basically it's not there. And there's an interesting object lesson from the 1980s in this regard. First of all, the Whitlam government, then the Fraser government, and then the Hawke government, they all embraced multiculturalism. This was a great thing, and they were very enthusiastic about it and buoyed up with the excitement of it, carried along. And at the end of the 80s, I was asked to chair a committee to inquire into our immigration policies. And what we found was that multiculturalism was on the nose. There was widespread mistrust, misunderstanding. There was a belief that it was about social engineering to change the very nature of Australian society, all of this kind of stuff, because the government, in its enthusiasm, had neglected the need to bring the populace along with them. Indeed, when we finished that report, and I went to see the Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, he was just disbelieving. He said, no, he said, no, Fitzy, that's just a few racists, you know, they're in a minority, you know, multiculturalism's all right. But I'm pleased to say that the government in the end and the officials did see the necessity to do something about it, and so good settlement policy and good messages became more important to that government. And I think you can see in the present just writ large what happens when a government neglects all of these things. So, to Professor Sun, I think there's no one better qualified that I know of in Australia to help us examine these issues and find a way forward. She is, as Daphne said, a Professor of Media and Cultural Studies at UTS, Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities, and a member of the College of Experts of the Australia Research Council. But when you look at her work over the last 20 years, those titles are really not the important part. It is a very, very impressive record of research and writing. And she has been not in any way a kind of ivory tower academic. She has been out there engaging in debate, writing for media, and really kind of mixing it up as a very outstanding academic, giving to the community the benefit of her research and her findings. Her research and interests have been really very wide-ranging. They've covered immigration, internal migration in China, and social problems in China itself. They cover research into diasporas in a number of parts of the world, including particularly here in Australia, and also research on Chinese language media in different international settings and here in Australia. It's mostly through the latter that I know her work, and I think it is of critical importance to our understanding of Chinese communities. In this current public debate, so much that is said and written about Chinese communities in the Australian media is uninformed and basically pretty ignorant and often prejudiced and ideological. In 2017, Professor Sun published a significant report called Chinese Language, Media and Social Cohesion in Australia. Social cohesion. Because what she found in there, and she will probably talk about some of this today, was that there were trends inside social media that you could see that were inimical to the idea of social cohesion in our society. She was one of the first and remains perhaps the leading researcher in Australia to be going deeply into the question of social media. It's a fantastic resource for finding out what's trending in different communities, what they think about Australian politics, about China, and many other things. And from her research, which has continued since that report, she has garnered enormously important insights into Chinese communities. I'm delighted to be able to introduce her today, and now I invite Professor Sun to give the 2020 Henry Chan lecture. Thank you, Wanning.
Thank you very much, Steve, for the very kind introduction. Can I also take this opportunity to thank Steve for the support that you've given me over the last quite a few years, and I have benefited enormously from Steve's mentoring. I also like to thank Daphne and Michael and everybody who works so hard behind the scene to make this event happen. It may look like pretty low key because there are so few of you here, but I know that it is a very important event, and I'm really, really honored to have this opportunity to speak to you today. Now to the presentation itself, which is called Multicultural Citizenship, Reimagined, Engage Migrants from China. So the title sounds fairly abstract. So let me kind of start with a tiny little concrete detail. When a Qantas plane carrying 240 Chinese Australian citizens from Wuhan touched down on Christmas Island in early February this year, a woman who was just disembarked from the aeroplane was asked by a journalist to say a few words. And she said, she said, "When we landed, the captain said, 'Welcome home.' And then she started to sob uncontrollably, and she was choking on her own words." So I heard that on the radio, and I've had a lot of time to think why this little casual and even kind of routine remark from Qantas pilot had moved her so much. And I came to the conclusion that apart from being really relieved to be finally home after a long flight from China, I think she might have felt included as an Australian by the captain's welcome home message. Australia is a multicultural society, which people from all over the world with different cultures and religions call home. And the captain, as a true blue Aussie, if you like, nicely, if not consciously, reinforced this message of Australia as a home for people from different cultures and religions. Of course, it is possible that I have read too much into this comment. But I do see her tears not just as tears of gratitude for being flown out of China on a charter flight, but also being recognized as an Australian despite her being Chinese and despite having ongoing connection to her own motherland. Unfortunately, public comments such as these have become increasingly few and far between. More often than not, we hear comments that end up making the Chinese Australians feel excluded rather than included. For instance, in late August, our acting Immigration Minister Alan Tudge observed with regret that some communities are still seen by their former countries as their diaspora. He did not explicitly mention China, but we all know he was referring to China. So Mr. Tudge's remarks suggest that people have to choose. Either you're staying on as part of their diaspora, or you're trying to become proud Australians. But in order to qualify as a proud Australian, there can be no tension, no ambiguity, no ambivalence, no internal struggles for the individual about who they are and which country they wish to identify with. So Mr. Tudge's remark signaled to me as an academic a profound and a worrisome kind of shift, if you like, from a previous way of imagining citizenship in multicultural Australia, whereby a connection to your own country of origin as well as your country of residence was not only tolerated but also celebrated. Tudge's remark, together with statements made by many other commentaries that Steve was referring to, really forced this question on all of us. That is, what does citizenship mean in a multicultural nation such as Australia? What should we aspire to if we want to ensure that all citizens feel able to make claims, to fulfill their responsibilities, and to exercise their rights as citizens? So today, in this talk, I want just to share with you some of my own thinkings on this question. And I want to do this by taking on three tasks, if you like. First, I want to review some recent changes in Chinese migration to Australia. Second, I would like to outline some of the main issues and challenges facing the first generation Mandarin-speaking PRC migrants, such as myself. And finally, I would like to discuss some possible ways of reimagining multicultural Australia in the geopolitical circumstances that we find ourselves in today. I have to say that what I'm going to say here today is based on my own analysis. I'm fairly confident that the opinions that I expressed are kind of securely grounded in my own observation and in my own evidence-based research. But I cannot, of course, claim that I speak on behalf of the entire first generation migrant Mandarin community. And that is a point I want to stress. Okay, let's begin with a brief review of the recent history of Chinese migration, particularly for the benefit of the people who are very young. We need to run back a few decades to the late 1970s, the end of the White Australian policy, at the beginning of the end of the Cold War, and the start of China's economic reform and its open door policy. Now, it was then Australia resumed immigration from the Chinese mainland starting from the 1980s, and it started to accelerate in the 1990s after a few decades of virtually no arrivals at all from China. So to differentiate this cohort from the mainland Chinese cohort, from the older generation, Cantonese and Southern dialect-speaking migrants, these PRC migrants are often referred to as the 新移民, the new migrants. Among the earliest 新移民and the earliest arrivals in this wave were the 45,000 Chinese nationals who came around the times of the Tiananmen. Now, for those who are old enough to remember, that is. And they were allowed to stay in Australia permanently. These are the generation that were later on referred to as Hawke's children, Bob Hawke's children. Professor Gao Jia from Melbourne University actually has written a couple of books particularly on their experience. So the decision on the part of the Hawke government to allow these individuals to migrate signaled the beginning of a major demographic shift within the Chinese community in Australia. So today in Australia, the majority of the Chinese migrants speak Mandarin rather than Cantonese, use WeChat rather than WhatsApp as their preferred social media, and write simplified Chinese characters rather than using traditional classical Chinese characters. And as for the Australian public, what they have seen is a gradual change in the restaurant menu, right? In addition to the Cantonese-style sweet and sour pork, Mongolian lamb, and the honey prawns, you all have had them, we now also have Chemmermouse pork, northern handmade noodles, and Shanghai pan-fried dumplings. So many of those who arrived in the 80s and 90s, they're mostly now in their 50s and 60s. They were allowed to stay initially on compassionate grounds, while the more recent arrivals after them, that is the people who arrived in the 90s and early 2000, came on skilled visas, right? And especially in the last decade or so, many international students have arrived, some with intention to migrate. And now, these are the ones we call the new migrants, 新移民, right? So, as a result, you can see, even within the PRC migrant cohort, the intergenerational differences in social values, in political views, in cultural sensibilities, and consumption habits can be very, very different. Difference can be quite pronounced. These new migrants have also challenged many old assumptions about the Chinese migrant communities. For instance, they no longer live in ghettos or ethnic enclaves. They don't fit into the stereotype of the Chinese migrants as being mostly restaurant owners, laundromat owners, or vegetable gardeners. In fact, a recent report has uncovered a large number of very successful business people that started as they were born in China, educated in Australian universities, then started companies in Australia. And their businesses can be found in all industry sectors across Australia. And they bring a very important economic benefits to the nation. And they bring diverse thinking, innovation, and growth to the Australian business landscape as well. And they offer an important bridge between Australia and China. Now, another interesting thing about this new migrant community cohort is their style of organization. I mean, this is kind of sociological kind of perspective, if you like. Like the older Chinese community associations, which are usually based on the kind of traditional leadership hierarchies, organizational structures, and channels of communication, the new cohort usually organizes and communicates online and via social media. What does this mean? It means that their spaces of association are often virtual, and they're sometimes more virtual than physical. And there's also much less hierarchy. in the way they organize. And also the emergence of leadership in this community is more organic rather than formally elected. Connections and associations among them also tend to be more ephemeral and fluid than old structures. What is often forgotten is that this new cohort is marked by diversity, very diverse, in terms of place of origin, history of migration, and sometimes with big differences in politics, religion, and ethnicity. Too often, it is the minority on each two ends of the spectrum that gets the most airtime, that gets the attention of our media. Right? At one end, you hear the extremely active, sometimes quite belligerent anti-CCP activists and agitators. You hear a lot from them. And at the very other end, all the scrutiny is on the hunt for spies and agents of the United Front. But what is most important to remember is that between these two extremes lie the silent majority. And it's this silent majority that really interests me. This majority, their political views come in what I call the 50 shades of grey. These 50 shades of grey are not only in relation to each individual's level of attachment to, identification with, and support for China or even the CCP. They are also in relation to a wide range of issues in Australia, including indigenous issues, the environmental issues, economics, gender and sexuality, religion, and human rights. This may not be newsworthy, and it's very hard for journalists to sensationalize, but my research suggests that most Chinese Australians prefer not to be represented by or associated with the so-called pro-China camp or anti-China camp. They simply want to get on with their lives. Now, this internal diversity in itself is not surprising, and nor should it be a problem. But what does become problematic is that despite the obvious plurality of views and values, many commentators continue to assume that the new Chinese Australians are a monolithic group. In other words, they're all the same. Clearly, such diversity also poses a challenge to Australia's multicultural policy, as is currently understood. Now, as early as 2011, almost 10 years ago, my friend and colleague, Professor Andrew Jakubowicz, a sociologist, and he observed that multicultural political analysis tend to examine ethnic group as a subset of interest group politics, and therefore construct a view of Australian society that frames ethnic communities as interest groups with specific, usually first-generation concerns. Andrew also observed that the Chinese community don't really have enough in common to be thought of as a cohesive interest group. For instance, the PRC may claim to be the custodian of some kind of of Chinese identity, but refugees and individuals from Tibet and Uyghurs from Xinjiang bring with them a long history of resistance and opposition, right? So this diversity poses a big problem for multiculturalism. Again, I quote Andrew. He said, "The Chinese community represents an emerging and a unique constellation of factors that multiculturalism was never designed to accommodate and manage." So that was as early as 2011. Andrew already foresaw that Australia's multiculturalism was in trouble because he had to be reckoned with what he called the China question, the Chinese question. So the second focus of my talk today is a range of key issues and major challenges facing the Chinese community. Now, 10 years from Andrew's article, Australia now is confronted with a much more polarized geopolitical dynamics involving China, the US, with Australia caught in the middle. But are we getting any closer to solving the China question? You probably agree with me here. The answer from me is that no. In fact, if you look at how some politicians and media commentators talk about Chinese Australians, you could be forgiven for thinking that we actually have gone backwards. In recent years, as China-Australian relations started to sour, many Chinese Australians I have talked to feel increasingly alienated from the place they now call home. To their growing bemusement and often anguish, they find themselves often targeted as objects of suspicion and distrust. Now, this can range from really subtle insinuations to quite blatant finger pointing. We have seen the whole sort of spectrum. At the tabloid end of the media spectrum, you have people such as Andrew Bolt, who from the Daily Telegraph, who write articles, saying 1 million Chinese here may not be on our side, right? And he would describe the Australians with Chinese ancestry as security risk. Meanwhile, at the so-called quality journalism end of the spectrum, you also have commentators such as Peter Harcher, for instance, who call for a change of immigration policy that favors Hong Kong and Taiwan migrants rather than mainlanders, because he believes that the former have values that are more compatible with Australian values. So it seems to me that there is a blind spot in this narrative of the untrustworthy PRC diaspora. Why do I say this is a blind spot? Because modern China has never experienced anything else other than one-party rule. Migrants from this era, from this country, not to mention those who remain in China, did not choose to live in the Communist Party. They were born into the system. And it's not that this is CCP and there's a range of other parties and these people decide to side with the CCP. So it is kind of both unfair and illogical to assume that the PRC citizens, the migrants, are loyal to the CCP simply because they live or have lived in a nation that happened to be ruled by their party. At the same time, just because many people in China's Chinese diaspora, China's diaspora communities rather, just because they do not support the CCP, does not necessarily mean that everyone wants to be a card-carrying dissident, or they want to cut their professional or business ties with China. Left or right, many politicians, the media, and the public commentators do not seem to recognize that the internal struggle facing this group in terms of what positions they should take, especially on issues where Australia and China are at loggerheads. When I say internal struggles, I mean both the struggles within the individual self and the clashes of views within the group. Politicians and public commentators also need to realize that the great majority of migrants from China are individuals with complex agency, who have the capacity to live with tension and internal conflicts. Although some may be quite nationalistic about China, they're not necessarily doing the bidding of the CCP. While a small minority may feel that they need Australian government to protect them from what they fear the Chinese government may do to them, them simply want to stop being the pawn between the two countries. They don't want to be put in either the pro-China or the anti-China camp. They just want to get on with their work and their lives. Political integration is never an easy process for new migrants. We all know that. So despite the successes in businesses and their professions, many first-generation migrants do lack social capital and do lack social networks, English not being their first language, and is a very difficult barrier to overcome. And coming from a country with one-party rule, they do not arrive already fully equipped with the political knowledge, competence, and the skills that are required to become fully functional in a liberal democratic system. And despite their growing numbers, we see very few leadership figures emerging from this cohort, whether it's in the corporate sector, the public sector, or various levels of politics. As if the obstacles were not enough, what is also happening is a growing level of what I call political disenfranchising. While my own research has unearthed a very high level of interest among Chinese Australians in participating in Australian politics, the current political climate has made it all but impossible for them to enter politics. Anyone with a mainland background runs the risk of being suspected of or insinuated as having links to or being associated with the CCP. But my current research on how first-generation Mandarin-speaking migrants use social media suggests two things. First, members of this community love Australia and feel lucky to be living here. They are active promoters of public diplomacy for both Australia and China, and they don't feel that these two things have to be mutually exclusive. Second, there is a high level of ambivalence on the part of many individuals in this group about their identity, their sense of belonging, and as a result, they experience considerable, what I call cognitive dissonance. But they live out this tension, this struggle and dissonance on a daily basis. Now, this may manifest itself on where they stand on big issues such as South China Sea or Huawei. It may also manifest itself in daily, mundane circumstances. For instance, this year, the Mid-Autumn Festival also happened to be on the same day as the China's national holiday, which is official CCP designated national holiday. So many festival greetings that were circulated on WeChat and other Chinese social media played on the theme of two festivals, one celebration. But I actually noticed some discussions in my WeChat group with somebody, his remark caught my attention, and he said, of course with a touch of sarcasm, "Oh, national holiday and lunar holiday all in one. But one is official, the other is lunar. So do we need to clear with ASIU before we celebrate it?" Of course, sarcastic, but this is the kind of reality we're living with. Another issue facing this community has been anti-Chinese racism, which has been on the rise for several years now due to China's influence discourse, and now it has been brought to the fore by the COVID-19 pandemic. In some of the WeChat groups I follow, people share their experience of encountering racism and give each other moral support, sometimes offering advice about how to respond when they encounter random racism, subtle or blatant, verbal or physical, direct or indirect, in the streets, in the shops, or on public transport. And I I see the sense of anguish, the anger, and sometimes a sense of helplessness that follow these ephemeral incidents that cannot easily be documented, but nevertheless have long-lasting and profound impact. Individuals may see little point in reporting that somebody has just shouted, "Go back to China," at them. But this does not necessarily mean they're not mentally or emotionally affected by it. Now, turning to my final topic of how we might reimagine multicultural citizenship, I want to return to the challenge posed by Professor Andrew Jakubowicz. That is, how to use the Chinese question to modernize Australia's multiculturalism. My answer, I'm going to just put it there for you, feel free to disagree, is twofold. The first aspect is engagement. The second aspect is human rights. Now let's deal with engagement first. Migration studies and the multicultural studies scholars tend to contrast assimilation with integration. As Steve just mentioned, there's two options, and obviously the current consensus being that integration is preferable to assimilation. And Australia's multiculturalism has certainly been practiced on the assumption that integration of new migrants into Australia's political, economic, cultural and social life is essential to achieving social cohesion. However, as far as this particular cohort that I'm talking about, as far as this cohort is concerned, I believe there's a long way to go before we could effectively talk about integration. What I mean is that before integration, something else needs to happen. And that something else is engagement. In other words, engagement is the precursor, if you like, or the prerequisite, if you like, for integration. At the moment, this engagement is not happening. We therefore need to go back to square one and start from there. Australia's public diplomacy strategy document from DFAT clearly states that diaspora communities not only play a key role in projecting contemporary Australia to the region, but also contribute to fostering a cohesive, harmonious and stable Australia society. So it is clear that intention is to engage. However, what we now see is a clear tension between the government's public diplomacy agenda of engagement through the diaspora on one hand, and the security institutions' agenda on the other hand, which sees this community mainly as security risk. So this is clearly alienating rather than engaging. One is pulling, the other is pushing. And this is the push and the pull dynamics within Australia. And on top of these dynamics in Australia, there is another set of push and pull dynamics at work, with China's soft power through diplomacy agenda being the pulling factor, and the anti-Chinese forces within Australia being the pushing factor. So, as far as I can see, this is a community that is living in the middle of this pushing and pulling. As far as I can see, a more modern multicultural policy in relation to any group should adopt the following practices. 1, you should stop expecting this community to choose one country over another. 2, you should go beyond seeing this community solely through the lenses of security risks and threats. 3, you should stop treating this community merely as potential voters, merely as partners in transactional relationships. And 4, we should start treating this community as rights-bearing citizens with human rights. Now, there really needs to be some serious change at the level of rhetoric level of attitude, policy, and practice. At the moment, we're not even ready to consider changing the rhetoric. That is why I say we still have a long way to go. Now, I would like to address the second part of this modernization process, modernization of our multicultural policy, that is. The second aspect is human rights. Recently, on ABC's Radio National's Breakfast program, Hamish MacDonald interviewed Jason Lee, who is the president of Australian China Forum. Hamish MacDonald suggested, he asked Jason, he said, there is a real question about Chinese government and CCP influence on Australia, and how do we address that without having an impact on the Chinese Australian communities that is here? Jason Lee's response was, I think the answer to that is that we have to proceed from the starting point of trusting our own citizens. So if you're an Australian citizen, you deserve that trust. Because if we start distrusting our citizens, if that's our starting point, then that goes against our values. I think Jason Lee is spot on. And I also think I also take Jason Lee's point as a point about human rights. I hope this will be the main messages from my main talk today, for the government, for the politicians, the policymakers, and the public commentators. That is, Australia's Mandarin-speaking first-generation migrants are now rights-bearing Australian citizens, and discrimination against them on the basis of where they come from and what they look like is not compatible with human rights value. And it's only when we actually start to respect the human rights of these new citizens that Australia as a country can sustain its own moral outrage and its own moral purchase of human rights discourses in its own criticism of China of human rights issues. Now, this human rights argument is not mine. I didn't come up with this. I actually borrowed it again from Andrew. Recently, Andrew Jagabowicz commented on what he called xenophobia in times of COVID-19. And he wrote, I now quote, "Identity within and attachment to Australia for ethnic immigrants depend on how well the system they enter protect their human rights from the omnipresent threat from racism and xenophobia. They will not release their grip on the old if the new emerges as threatening and potentially dangerous." Education also has a role to play in facilitating engagement. Since most first-generation migrants from the PRC come as adults, by default, they miss the primary and the secondary education in Australia, which is where knowledge about Australian history is taught, where informal citizenship education happens, and where political understanding is absorbed. How does the parliament work? How do we vote? All these kind of knowledges, they are taught not in the tertiary education, but in the secondary and primary education, and they miss the boat. So we need to ask what our universities, adult migrant education centers, and other education agencies are doing to fill this gaping hole. Another problem, as far as I can see, is the lack of engagement between the first-generation PRC migrants and the earlier dialect-speaking Chinese communities. This again is due to a range of reasons, cultural, linguistic, and historical. And the current political climate hasn't made it easy for the various Chinese communities to break down this barrier. In order to prove one's political cleanliness from the Chinese influence, some people from the Chinese communities, especially from the ABCs, that is Australian-born Chinese, they feel that they need to go out of their way to identify themselves as non-mainlanders. So the disconnection between various Chinese communities is understandable. I understand that. And it does have many reasons. For instance, the difference between Cantonese and the Mandarin is huge. It's so great that the two groups often have to talk to each other through using English. I myself, I've been here for 30 years, and I'm still trying to learn Cantonese. And I'm still struggling. Still can't go beyond Ha Gao, Ha Chang, and Siu Mai. Right. Beyond the milieu of Yamcha, my Cantonese vocabulary is virtually non-existent. I'm embarrassed to say. But more than ever before, Chinese Australians of various cohorts have to work together to fight anti-Chinese racism and take part in struggles for political rights. I'm not arguing for some kind of unity just because they happen to be Chinese. I don't buy that discourse. They all come in different shades of political persuasions, right? And they have all different points of views. But there needs to be some kind of solidarity in the fight against the racism. And this connection is not actually working to make that happen. After all, when Senator Abetz recently questioned the three Chinese Australians, it was obviously on the basis of their race rather than their country of origin. So when Osman Chu wrote an article entitled, "I was born in Australia, why do I have to renounce the Chinese Communist Party?" This is a very legitimate question. But this question shouldn't be taken to mean that anyone who was born in China should be a legitimate target for Senator Abetz. As one of these three, unfortunately three that are questioned by Abetz, Zhang Yun or Yunjiang said in her statement, "No Australian, regardless of ethnicity, should be subject to political loyalty test. We're all Australians, first and foremost." Okay, engagement is a two-way street, I'm aware of that, involving both the self who is willing to engage and others who can imagine a way of engaging with others who are different from them. Therefore, I would like to say to my own fellow first-generation Chinese Australians that if we want to develop a true sense of belonging here and to start feeling really at home, we must be willing to engage. By this, I mean showing more interest in the history of this nation and its multicultural formations, finding ways of talking to your neighbors, making connection with other Chinese communities, participating in activities and events in the neighborhood, in your street, and developing connections and solidarities with other ethnic communities, and of course, and with the so-called mainstream society on a wide range of social issues. Engagement can be both mundane and organized. I'll give you an example of a mundane engagement. Someone, again, on my WeChat group, I call him Mr. Huang. He recently posted an image of a tree in his backyard. And he said, his neighbor popped over one day and said, you have to trim that tree, otherwise it's going to be a safety hazard. It's getting too big. And the neighbor also offered to lend him some tools from his own shed. Now, Mr. Huang already had the tools to cut the tree, but he took up the neighbor's offer to borrow some tools simply because, as he put it, "I wanted to have an excuse to get to know my neighbor, so I popped over, went to his shed, had a nice long chat with him, and got to know my neighbor now. I know my neighbor now." So it's clear to me that Mr. Huang only wanted to connect with his neighbor. But that's, I think, is multiculturalism at its very, very everyday, grassroots, mundane level. It's very important. Making connections, of course, can also take the form of collective organization. For instance, in June this year, Western Australian newspaper reported that the Chinese community in Perth had heard about some activists wanting to protest in support of Black Lives Matter, but they were worried about the COVID-19 and they didn't have enough masks. So within a fortnight, they used WeChat to organize themselves and donated 11,000 face masks to Perth's Black Lives Matter protest in a show of support. Now, you say, well, that's not a big deal. But you must remember that in today's political climate, civic action such as this, from this particular Chinese community, was very likely to be seen as either orchestrated by the CCP or trying to influence Australian politics in some way, right? So this is the backdrop against which they had to take action. Nevertheless, they went ahead and did that. So it seems to me that with their own actions, these Chinese Australian citizens made an eloquent point about their citizenship in multicultural Australia. As I hope I have shown, the Chinese question is a difficult one, but it's a very urgent one. Never before have Australia experienced a migration so massive, at the same time experienced China as both as a market and as a source of migration. So the China question is an urgent one. It is at the very center of the process of reimagining multicultural citizenship in our contemporary society. So the key message that I have a favorite, one of my favorite writers is E.M. Foster. And one of my favorite books written by him is Howard's Ends. And the key messages from his book is only connect. My message today is also to connect, to start engaging, so that instead of alienation, confusion, and disengagement, this group might start to feel that they are included, that their rights are respected, and that they too are true blue Aussies. I know, easy to say and difficult to do, I know that. But if we're willing to work towards this end, members of the Chinese Australian communities should find it easier to identify with and develop a sense of belonging to this country that they now call home. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wanning, for a really inspirational lecture. It's chock-a-block full of ideas and with good suggestions or recommendations as to how we can start to work our way out of this terrible situation in which we find ourselves at the moment. I'm going to throw it open to questions, and I'd like to ask, if you have a question, if you could just say who you are. Do we have a mic, by the way?
No, we're not using a mic.
No mic, but the acoustics are good enough.
Yes.
Okay.
Or you can repeat questions.
And also people who are watching on Zoom, we invite you as well to submit questions in writing, and we have one of our committee up the back who will be taking down questions if you have them. So we don't have any yet, as far as I can see, but do we have questions from the audience? Yes.
Marcus Rubenstein, Wanning, thanks for a wonderful and marvellous lecture. Very, very important words, and I hope they resonate. Well, this question is probably to you and Steve. You know, we're aware of the many problems that we face, but what do you see that gives you optimism? The Chinese people are generally quite optimistic. They always look towards a brighter future. What do you see in the Chinese community and the Chinese-Australian relations now, which gives you hope, which is a beacon of hope for a better future?
Wanning?
Steve?
Okay. Where are the silver linings? The first silver lining, it's more than a lining, it's a substance, is the nature of Chinese people themselves. I think that there is in our Chinese communities enormous resilience, notwithstanding the pressures that Wanning described of the push-pull and all of these other things that are crowding in on them. Chinese people have shown this kind of resilience, not just in today's Australia, but in many countries around the world when they've been challenged in this way. We have to remember that over the period of the Cold War, when the message of suspicion was coming mainly from the United States, which described overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia particularly as a fifth column for the Chinese government. And in almost every Southeast Asian country in the 50s and 60s, there were anti-Chinese pogroms. Tens and tens of thousands were driven out of Indonesia, for example. And that is before the big events of 1965. But we can see from this, what we can learn from this is that the capacity to survive through this kind of situation, but also to grow through a couple of things. One is the enormous commitment to education, and the other is through enterprise, and a third, which is, I think, come to the fore here in Australia in the period since 1989, is cultural creativity. We have a really vibrant culture amongst Chinese who came here in the wake of the Tiananmen episode, and far from being set back and downtrodden by this, they've shown that they can go on to greater things, contributing not just as part of a community, but to the greater Australian society. So that's, I think that the answer lies in Chinese people themselves. As to Australia-China relations,
yeah, I would just concur and echo what Steve has just said, and I think this people-to-people diplomacy and the kind of work that individuals do on a daily basis, and they have a long-lasting, sustainable kind of impact. At the end of the day, more than ever before, the life between the Chinese migrants and so-called mainstream Australia have become more enmeshed. They married each other. They started to, produce children, and so that's another reason I think it's a ray of optimism that it's the next generation. The next generation, or the 1.5 generation, and I have seen them being engaged politically and educated here, but not only bilingual in a linguistic sense, but in terms of cultural sensibility, being able to translate across cultures, and also they're not going to take a discrimination lying down. They are very assertive about what their rights are, and they are very good at asserting them. So I see that the younger generation as our hope.
Thanks, Stephen. I want to thank Coming for a very inspiring talk.
This is a question from Joshua Bird to all the panels.
So hang on. Okay, we'll take the one from Joshua and come back to you, Helen.
Sorry. Do you see more or better work being done by governments at the state or local levels versus the national level, or are they all taking the same approach?
That certainly is a question for you, Steve. I'm an anthropologist. I only deal with on the ground sort of grassroots level?
In my observation, and it's not something I've researched, but in my observation, I think it is somewhat better at the state and grassroots level. All of the states have multicultural councils or ethnic communities councils, whatever they call themselves, and they do work at it. The lower down the scale you go in politics, the more Chinese you will see, or Chinese Australians, in government. So in local government, it is not uncommon to see several people of Chinese origin as members of local councils. The further up the scale you go, by the time you get to the national parliament, well, we know, we've counted that, and I think, as I said at the beginning, I think there has been a neglect of the necessary policies, the programs to support the policies, and the positive messaging. To give you an example of how unpositive that messaging is, every year I do a count of the people who receive honours, that is from the Commonwealth Government. And you have to go a long way down before you find the first, obviously, Chinese name. And when you get to the end and you add them up, it's pretty pathetic in terms of not just Chinese, but Asians and Asian Australians in general. What this says about the attitudes of people who are making those decisions at the Commonwealth, the ruling end of the Commonwealth, is that these people are not valued in the same way as Caucasians. Helen.
You answered part of my question anyway, so I don't answer the question anymore about lack of leadership in our Chinese community. So my question actually is, you were talking about being we have to have solidarity, but I beg to differ actually, because the question really is, if you have solidarity, you almost seem to try to divide the Chinese community as a core, as one group, against the mainstream. So how can we be integrating when you have solidarity and individuality, if you like?
I may not have made myself clear. I meant solidarity not only with other Chinese, within the various Chinese-speaking communities, but also with other ethnic communities, as well as with mainstream societies on a wide range of social issues. For instance, there is discussions actually within the group about whether we should just only complain or protest when we, as Chinese, are discriminated. What about the other ethnic communities when they are marginalized, or should we actually work with them and to fight against injustice and social injustice? What about the people who who have other, who are not necessarily ethnic, but actually have some other social issues, such as gay and lesbian groups, or people with disabilities? So this or a whole range of environmental and social issues. I meant solidarity. I did not mean within the Chinese group. I mean forging connection within. It would be good for them to talk to connect, but also to connect with the mainstream, with other ethnic communities.
Totally agree.
Yeah. In fact, it's interesting that you should mention that, because I personally think the Chinese Americans have gone one step ahead of the Chinese Australians, partly because of the 1.5 generation. You probably have heard of Eileen Huang, who started this very, very important debate between herself. She's Yale educated, humanities kind of student, master's student. And she started this debate between her generation and her parents' generation. It was all done on WeChat. You know, she basically called on her parents' generation to get out of that narrow-minded sort of we Chinese, we must protect ourselves. You know, we should actually show some solidarity for the Black Lives Matter movement. So there's a lot of very, very interesting debate there. We are watching what our American sort of Chinese communities are doing, but it's not happening much here at the moment.
Can I just follow that up and ask, what should the older communities be doing to engage more with the newer communities? How can they be effective in trying to bridge that gap?
That's really a good question, because as I said, even within the PRC cohort, there are people who are already in their 50s and 60s, and they have had children. The children are going to universities, so you obviously have two generations here, and that divide between the two generations is so stark. And I think what the older generation could do is to start listening to your children, and actually do not treat your children as if just your children, and actually to consider them as equal partners in this kind of discussion. And that is exactly what was happening. This Eileen Huang, she was in her early 20s something, she wrote this open letter to my parents and her generation. And so the people of her parent generations wrote open letters also openly to her, criticizing her, calling her child. You are a child. What do you know? You know. So that's this. I think the best you could do, the least you could do, is actually not to treat them as just children, but actually give them the benefit of doubt, listen to them, and you might learn something from them. And after all, they are here, they're educated here, they know a lot more about how this society operates than you do. So I think they should be all more open-minded. And through their children, and through their dialogue with their children, getting to become more open to the so-called mainstream society. Because, you know, typical Chinese families, you know, if children don't agree with their parents over politics, don't do it over dinner table, right? Leave the politics at door, right? And that's exactly what's happening in the US. That is changing. The parents, some parents welcome this and very proud of their children doing this to them, and some feel really, really quite threatened.
We have a question from one of our Zoom participants.
It's from Sel J. How should the Chinese Australian community move forward and engage with the younger generation of non-Chinese Australians? For example, the Zoomers to millennials, as this group is also susceptible to online and social media disinformation and also suffering from financial consequences as a result of capitalism, politics and COVID-19, and are using Chinese as a scapegoat of their anger?
Very big question. I'm not really sure whether the person who asked this question was referring to the high level of disinformation and misinformation on Chinese language social media, or is he or she making a point about social media in general. But in any case, I would say that the younger generations are more tech savvy, and they live on social media, and I guess, you know, the best way to deal with disinformation is to become more information literate, right? So that, you know, people have the capacity to figure out, you know, what is disinformation, what is misinformation, and what is genuine and good value information. And again, it happens all the time, you know, it happens anywhere, everywhere, and it's not an issue that's specific to any particular generation. But I'm not really sure how best to answer the question, because I don't know where you're coming from in terms of, are you actually assuming that older generation are less able to deal with social media than younger generation? Or if that's the case, and I think younger generations might actually be able to teach the old generation a thing or two about social media.
We have another question on Zoom. No, I can't see. Is that saying yes or no?
This one.
No.
Yes.
Yes.
Thumbs up.
Okay, sorry. From Erin Chu, one issue which disengages ABC's Australian-born Chinese in engaging with the new mainland Chinese community and with China itself is that they are unable or ashamed that they cannot speak any Chinese, primarily Mandarin. How important do you think language is in improving this engagement and better understanding?
I really don't think there is any need to feel embarrassed or ashamed of not being able to speak Chinese. If you're not born in China, and how could you easily speak Chinese? I don't really see that's a source of embarrassment. Whether that's a significant barrier or not really depends on what you want to do and what are you trying to do. I guess the more language capacity, the better. It's always language. When you learn a language, you not just learn a language. You learn a way of understanding how a culture see things and understands things. So language is important because it carries with it a certain kind of cultural sensibility, if you like. So try your best to learn language, but I don't think it's the most important thing. It's not going to stop you from engaging at all. That's my view, anyway.
Yes.
We're talking about communication in terms of spoken languages, but actually it's more than that. Chinese have one advantage, that we all read the same language. Although we may speak different dialects, but we're lucky that we can read the same written languages. So that is also part of the communication between different groups. I come from the newspaper, so I'm a print media people. There's basically seems to consider the simplifies character and traditional, but I recently put up an example that during the Tiananmen incidents, the newspaper in Chinese print here were all in traditional writing, but most of the readers are from China. So that means that the simplified or traditional is not really the key issue. It's the matter that print on the paper that's the issue. And because the Tiananmen incident was attract so much attention from those people or the students at the time, although they never learned to read or write traditional Chinese characters, but they still read it because the event was so important. So I believe the prejudice about simplify or tradition is really a matter of mental, because Chinese don't read word by word. You read by sentences. So so all these things is part of the communication. Although people who get together, one who speak Mandarin and one speak Cantonese, but that doesn't mean that they cannot communicate.
No, that's true.
Yes, Peter.
Peter Manning. I've got a media background, and I find it very difficult not to think about the power of the media, particularly the Murdoch media in Australia, as we've heard from both sides of politics recently. So my question is, very much it seems to me that every second day we hear about what Five Eyes Network is saying and what it's doing and how we've got to fit in with it and so on and so on. And I'm particularly interested, Stephen, in your reaction to that kind of sense of the Anglosphere, which is pitted against any other spheres, and in particular the rise of China and how that challenges our society, which is sort of thought of as part of the Anglosphere, not multicultural at all. Multiculturalism is a new thing, but the real Australia, in inverted commas, is the Five Eyes idea of Anglo-Saxon people and their needs and interests. And I think, do you think, I suppose I'm asking, do you think that there's a sort of trickle-down effect that comes from that kind of leadership and thinking down to, the Peter Harchers and the other people, the Nick McKenzies and so on, in the media, who pick up on this sort of scepticism about China and what it means for Australia?
I'd make a couple of points in answer. One is that when you have a national parliament and a ministry in which you have virtually no Chinese, and there are one or two people, there's Penny Wong, but one or two people who have learnt some Chinese, that not the ones that I know to a level of fluency or being able to easily read Chinese. But when you have such a monocultural parliament, it's not surprising that they're not picking up anything of subtlety or all the differences that Wanning talked about. If they were able to access that, just don't have to read a newspaper, but just if they were able to access social media and see the many currents that are going on, they might perhaps be giving out different messages. The second part of my answer to your question actually is provided by you, not this afternoon, but in what you have described as access journalism. And for those who are not familiar with the concept, Peter and various other of his colleagues here and in other countries have been talking and writing about this phenomenon as something which has replaced investigative journalism. Access journalism is where a journalist has access to a minister or a staffer or a particular public servant, and they get the drop or the feed or whatever it is. So something is provided to the particular journalist by this minister or staffer. They take it. They're in the middle of the 24-hour cycle, so they just take it and they write it, they give it to their editor, and away it goes. And there's very little investigation of what they've been fed. And this, I think, is, it's across the board, it's not just to do with China, but because of the general lack of literacy about China, even before you get to the question of specific literacy, like being able to read and write, but the China literacy in the sense of knowing about the country, knowing where it's coming from, knowing about the culture, the way it has seen the world over the years, all of that kind of stuff. The lack of that means that there is no capacity for people to challenge or question, and so they take the feed, they publish it, and that's it. And so I've been appalled, I have to say, at the lack of challenge to these stories that are fed out to a waiting and willing journalist. And then, of course, they feed off each other. So it's quite difficult in this environment to break through that. And I think this is one of the big challenges we face in trying to get things back together, not just in our relations with China, but in the way in which we approach multiculturalism in respect of our Chinese communities and the kind of programs and policies that we have and the messages we give. Now, Wanning, you might like to comment further on that.
Exactly.
Daphne, how we? Oh, sorry, I'm being told that we have to wind up. But well, thank you all, and thank you, Wanning. I have really enjoyed that.
Thank you very much.